Hi everyone, and welcome to the Loved Series devotional material or home group material. It's so good to be with you as we unpack this understanding of this little four-lettered word called love, and what it means to be loved, and where does love start, and all of the compounding complexity of that four-lettered word. There's so much to it, and if you did watch the sermon on Sunday, I started this series with kind of unpacking the four words used to describe love in the Greek language, and I just started to touch on the little iceberg, a little piece of the iceberg, because it is so big, it's so complex, and even just in that passage that I read in 1 John on Sunday, there is so much to it. I know you're going to read it and unpack it a little bit as well. So here we go.
Yeah, I mean, I think love is such a difficult concept in some ways because it's such a foundation stone of humanity, of being human, the desire to be loved, the pursuit of love. You know, you have everyone from the Beatles who speak about how it's all you need. And then you've got Shakespeare, you know, who writes about love and how it alters not where alteration finds, and it's such a huge concept. And then 1 John 4 comes and tells us that at the end of the day,
so
God is love. And how do we understand that? So on the one hand, it's this really deep, profound thing that we know and that we seek and that we desire. And on the other hand, we also say things like, I love ice cream, or I love this series, or whatever. So we use it so flippantly, and that's perhaps where the Greek words help, because there's like degrees of things. You know, it's not sometimes we interchange like with love quite easily. But this passage in 1 John chapter 4, the context of this verse so it's from verse 7 really that we're going to read, but the context of the passage is that John is saying you've got to test and approve the Spirit. Don't just accept everything at face value. You've got to test and approve where these things really come from. And then he goes on to speak about how, you know, you should be able to tell the difference between things that are of God and things that are not. And then so basically this part about love really speaks about how this is the foundation stone of how you know whether something is of God or is not.
Yeah.
It's like, is it rooted in love? Because that is the essence of who God is. And so that's one of the ways that you can tell. Something may look good on the outside. Something may look profound or spiritual or all of those things. But if it doesn't have love at its center, then actually it's not of God.
Do you want to read that?
So let's read. I'm reading from the Amplified, which is a bit longer and more complicated, but I think it brings just another element and level of clarity. So 1 John 4 from verse 7 in the Amplified. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is or springs from God. And he who loves others is born of God and is coming progressively to know and understand God, to perceive, recognize, and get a better and clearer knowledge of him. He who does not love has not become acquainted with God, does not and never did know him, for God is love. That's like those 4 words, for God is love. That's such a finite and definitive and yet huge statement. In this the love of God was made manifest, where we are concerned, in that God sent his Son, his only begotten or unique Son, into the world so that we might live through him. In this is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation, the atoning sacrifice for our sin. Beloved, if God so loved us very much, we also ought to love one another. No one has at any time yet seen God, but if we love one another, God abides, lives, and remains in us. And his love, that love which is essentially his, is brought to completion, to full maturity, to run its full course. It is perfected in us.
Sure. There's so much in there to try and grasp, and I know that, you know, if you are joining us for the home group, actually Tuesday evenings, we're going to break into groups and discuss that in depth quite a bit, and the home groups themselves can mull over it and kind of get a deeper understanding from different people's perspectives. But just from my perspective, specifically this last week, I've seen the distorted side of love in action, not in our relationship or in with my children or with anybody that is close to me. But I've just seen in other people's interactions, I've started to notice and see how quickly or how over time love gets eroded, how love gets broken down, how love gets chewed up and spat out in so many ways. And yet
Thank you for clarifying that wasn't about me.
it definitely wasn't about you.
Okay.
I love you with all my heart. It wasn't about you. It just, there's certain things
not so subtle thing if it wasn't.
No, it definitely wasn't. No, there were just a couple of things that happened this week in certain scenarios. I'm not going to divulge into it, that we were just privy to, where we've seen love deteriorate, where we've seen love almost give up in a lot of ways. And it's so interesting to have that scenario playing yourself out in front of you, and doing a loved series and trying to put the context into love to you guys, but also seeing the other side of it in the week. And I think
maybe that's the tension that we hold and that we live with, is that we know that we are created for love. I think everyone fundamentally knows that, whether they believe in God or not, is that we know we are created to love and to be loved. And so much of that gets messed up. And so much of our perspective of love is warped because we live in this broken world where love is not perfect.
Yeah.
And then we have this very complex thing, because God is love, and fundamentally and rationally I can know that to be true, and even by faith I can know that to be true. But in reality, that is not always my experience. I don't always feel like God is this God of perfect love, because I live in such a broken world, and my instinct is to say, well, God, if you love me, then why A, B, C, and D? Like, why can't you fix all these problems? If
in
God,
the world, in my life,
if God really is a God of love, why is the world in the state that it is? And I guess that's why John carries on to tell us that this is how we have seen God's love revealed, is in the cross.
Yeah.
And so when we
imagine what the world would look like if God said, if He wiped His hands of us and said, "You guys have messed up so badly. You're on your own. Sort yourselves out." Imagine the mess we would have been in then. So it does give us a very different perspective when we view God through the essence of love. As I preached on Sunday, is when we start to view others in that way, ourselves in that way, God in that way, as the ultimate perfection of love, then suddenly all those questions kind of come into focus, and it all makes sense. Even when it looks broken in the world, there is a new perspective that we get because of the essence of love, and we understand what we would be without that.
Yeah. So I think for me, it's looking back always at everything kind of through the filter of the cross, and going like, that is how I know that God is love, because that is the length to which He would go to be in relationship with me, and that He would die for me, and to, when the world doesn't make sense and when things are really difficult, to keep looking at it through that lens, to say, I'm choosing to look at it through the lens of Calvary, because that is how I understand that I'm loved, no matter what happens in this life. But it's sometimes a difficult thing to hold. And then the other thing that's difficult to hold in that passage, is really challenging, is that it says, if you do not love, you do not know God. And so if you have not, Jesus said to His disciples in another place, this is how they will know that you're my disciples, if you love one another. That's in John chapter 15. And that's such a hard thing, because I don't know, the church is not, it's known for a lot of things, but being super loving is not always one of them.
We're falling majorly short at the moment with that. And I think the new dynamic of church and the new dynamic of the world is going to need the church to love differently, to really step out of the way we've done church and the way we are the church, and to do it differently, to start to think about it differently, start to love differently, and actually it will be like a refiner's fire, I think, this time, of us really coming to the realization of what our role is in the world. And that's what I think COVID-19 will bring for us.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a two-edged sword. It says those who don't know love don't know God. But it also says that anyone who experiences love experiences God. And so in a way, for me, that's a beautiful picture of any glimmer of love that I experience in my life, whether it's with my children, in my family, with my husband, with my friends, with whoever it might be. That glimmer of love that I experience is a little bit, it's like a reflection of the reality of who God is. And so in some ways, it's so easy to bring the reality of God to people by just being loving in sometimes seemingly small ways. So we hope that that's given you some food for thought and food for discussion. There'll be some discussion questions that come up at the end of this video, and that we would also have sent out to the group leaders who are going to be facilitating the discussions. And so we hope that you have some good debate and conversation, and that you really can flesh this out and really grow in your faith as you talk about this stuff.